The Canaanite prohibition, Ras Shamra, fertility cults, attachment theory, and the protective boundary of love. Welcome back. In episode 7 we explored the Hipha of the oath as gift. The name YHWH is pure being in personal covenant. The plural Elohim is a Trinitarian whisper. The Shamayim is the reconciliation of fire and water. The Haaretz is the healing of the vertical-horizontal split. And the Kal imperfect is simultaneously command and prophecy. Today we go into one of the most misunderstood elements of these 4 verses, the prohibition against the daughters of the Canaanites. The prohibition is often misread as ethnic prejudice or cultural tribalism. But when we bring the full weight of ancient Near Eastern archaeology, biblical theology, comparative religion, and contemporary psychology to bear on this text, we discover something entirely different. We discover one of the most sophisticated and most loving acts of protective discernment in the patriarchal narratives. The Ras Shamra tablets, discovered beginning in 1929 at the site of ancient Ugarit on the Syrian Mediterranean coast, are the most important single archaeological discovery for understanding the religious world of Canaan in the period of the patriarchs. These tablets, inscribed in alphabetic cuneiform and dating to approximately the 13th century before the Common Era, give us a vivid, detailed, and deeply disturbing portrait of the Canaanite religious universe. In these texts, the chief god El is portrayed as passive, remote, and easily manipulated. The storm deity Baal achieves and re-achieves his dominance through cycles of combat, death, and resurrection tied to the agricultural year. The goddess Anat is a warrior whose descriptions of violence are graphic and sustained. The fertility goddesses Asherah and Astarte are connected to ritual sexuality and the use of human bodies as instruments of divine appeasement. The relationships between these Canaanite deities, as the Ras Shamra texts describe them, are characterized by manipulation, coercion, power struggle, and the constant threat of divine violence. The Canaanite religious universe is a universe of competitive power, where authority is maintained through domination and where the relationship between the divine and the human is fundamentally transactional. The human being offers sacrifice, including at certain times and places the sacrifice of children in fire to Molech, in order to appease divine powers who would otherwise harm them. The entire structure of Canaanite religion is built on the foundation of fear. Into this universe of fear-based, power-driven divine-human relationship, the covenant revelation of YHWH brought something so radically different as to be almost incomprehensible to the Canaanite religious mind. YHWH does not need to be appeased. YHWH does not compete with other divine powers for supremacy. YHWH does not demand the sacrifice of children. YHWH enters into relationship with human beings through freely given covenant, through the initiative of love rather than the demand of power. The covenant of Genesis 12, the great Abrahamic commission, begins with God's uncaused, unmerited call and gift. Go and I will make you a great nation and I will bless you. There is no prior condition of human performance. There is only the divine initiative of grace. The incompatibility between the Abrahamic covenant and the Canaanite religious world is therefore not a conflict between cultures in the modern anthropological sense. It is a conflict between two fundamentally incompatible understandings of the nature of divine-human relationship, two completely different answers to the question of what the universe is ultimately about. And a woman formed in the Canaanite religious universe would have brought with her, however unconsciously, the implicit relational templates, the deep dispositional patterns, the habitual ways of relating to divine power, that had been formed in her by her cultural environment. Thomas Aquinas, in his concept of the habitus, the deep dispositional pattern formed by repeated actions in cultural immersion, described exactly this dynamic. A person formed in a culture of fear-based divine-human relationship does not simply hold wrong intellectual beliefs about the nature of God. They have been shaped at the level of their second nature, their habitus, to relate to the divine through appeasement, manipulation, and the constant anxiety of not having done enough to ward off divine displeasure. And that habit is, unless radically transformed by a fundamentally different encounter with the living God, will inevitably reproduce its patterns in the household it inhabits. Dr. Daniel Siegel's interpersonal neurobiology confirms this at the neurological level. Siegel's research shows that the right hemisphere of the brain carries implicit relational memory, the non-verbal, somatically encoded templates of how relationships work, what to expect from powerful others, whether the world is safe or threatening, whether the self is valued or expendable. These implicit templates are formed in early experience, particularly by the religious and cultural environment of childhood, and they operate largely below the level of conscious awareness. A child raised in the environment of Canaanite religion would have a right hemisphere implicit memory saturated with the relational templates of appeasement, manipulation, and the constant threat of divine displeasure. And those templates would govern her relational patterns in marriage, in child rearing, in worship, and in the transmission of spiritual formation to the next generation, in ways that her conscious intentions could not easily override. Ephraim the Syrian, the 4th century theologian called the harp of the Holy Spirit, offered an image for this prohibition that is remarkable for its tenderness. He wrote that the prohibition was like placing a lamp out of the wind. A lamp placed in a strong wind loses its flame not because the wind is evil but because fire and wind cannot sustain each other in their present conditions. The covenant flame of Abraham's household, precious and hard-won through decades of refinement and testing, could not be exposed to the wind of Canaanite religious culture without risk of extinction. Not because the Canaanite woman was evil as a person, but because the cultural wind she carried, the habitus formed by generations of fear-based religion, was incompatible with the nature of the covenant flame. Ephraim's image is not triumphalist. It does not look down on the Canaanites. It simply names, with pastoral clarity and without contempt, the reality that certain environments are incompatible with certain forms of life. The covenant flame needs a specific kind of shelter. And Abraham's prohibition is the act of providing that shelter. John Bowlby, the psychiatrist whose attachment theory became foundational in modern developmental psychology, and Mary Ainsworth, whose research on attachment styles gave the theory its empirical grounding, both demonstrated that our primary attachment relationships are not merely significant in our early years. They are the templates through which we experience all subsequent relationships, including our relationship with God. The partner we choose does not merely share our life. They participate in the ongoing formation of our inner world, our sense of self, our implicit expectations about the nature of love and safety and trustworthiness. Bernard of Clairvaux, in his magnificent sermons on the Song of Songs, described the soul that has reached the stage of love for God for the sake of God as a soul whose discernment has been purified. Its choices are no longer driven by impulse, appetite, or cultural habit. They are driven by pure love, by the clear-eyed recognition of what serves the covenant and what does not. Abraham's prohibition is the discernment of pure love. It is not rooted in fear of the Canaanites. It is rooted in love for the covenant, love for his son, love for the promise of God that must not be diluted or misdirected. The phrase "among whom I dwell" carries its own profound wisdom. Asher Anokhi Yosef B. Kirbo. Abraham does not pretend that the Canaanites do not exist or that they are without virtue. He has respected and been respected by individual Canaanites, as the negotiation of chapter 23 demonstrates. He acknowledges his embeddedness in their world with the honesty of the Yosef, the one who dwells, who sits, who is genuinely present among them. And from within that honest embeddedness, he draws his covenant boundary. This is not the boundary of someone who has never been exposed to the world. This is the boundary of someone who has been fully present to the world and has learned from within that presence what the covenant requires. For the listener who is trying to live faithfully in a world that does not share their covenant values, Abraham's "among whom I dwell" is the most practical word in these 4 verses. You can be fully present to your world, fully engaged with your colleagues and your neighbors and your culture, without surrendering the covenant core of your identity to the cultural wind around you. Abraham dwells among the Canaanites without becoming a Canaanite. He is in the world without becoming of the Canaanite spirit. But let us be careful here, because this wisdom about boundaries can be misused. The Canaanite prohibition is not a license for the kind of spiritual superiority that looks down on those outside the covenant community. Abraham respects his Canaanite neighbors. He trades with them. He negotiates with them. He buries his wife in their land. He is at peace with them. The boundary is not contempt. The boundary is the specific protection of the covenant intimate, the marriage relationship that will form the next generation's spiritual foundation. You can love your neighbors and still know that not every neighbor is the right person to form the covenant intimate of your household. For the person who has been told by a controlling religion that all boundaries are walls of pride, this text is liberating. Healthy boundaries are not walls. They are the container that allows the covenant flame to burn. You are allowed to protect the sacred space of your most intimate relationships. You are allowed to discern which influences strengthen your covenant identity and which ones subtly erode it. You are allowed to be at peace with your world while still being intentional about which relationships you allow to form the innermost chambers of your soul. Join us in episode 9 where we explore the great adversary of Kiaim, the redirection to El Molodeti, the ancient social infrastructure of the Malada, the Church's birth community, Cyril of Alexandria's typology, and the Marian resonance of Rebecca. Christ4Life143@gmail.com for prayer and connection. Subscribe and stay with us. Now let us bring the fullness of the attachment research to bear on the Canaanite prohibition, because the psychological wisdom embedded in this text is as precise and as contemporary as anything in the modern clinical literature. John Bowlby, whose attachment theory emerged from his clinical work with children separated from their parents during the Second World War, demonstrated that early attachment relationships create what he called internal working models, deep, largely unconscious templates of how relationships work, what to expect from caregivers, whether the self is worthy of love and protection, whether the world is a safe or dangerous place. These internal working models are not merely cognitive beliefs. They are embodied, emotional, neurological structures that govern the automatic patterns of relational response across the entire lifespan. Mary Main, working in the generation after Bowlby, developed the Adult Attachment Interview, a research instrument that reveals the quality of an adult's internal working model through the way they narrate their own childhood experiences. What she discovered is that the internal working model formed in childhood is the single best predictor of the quality of attachment that the same person will create with their own children. The patterns of relational experience transmit themselves across generations, not genetically but psychologically, through the internalized templates that unconsciously govern parenting behavior and intimate relating. This is precisely what Abraham understood about the Canaanite marriage prohibition. A woman formed in the Canaanite religious and cultural system carried an internal working model that had been shaped by the relational templates of that system. Appeasement as the strategy for relating to power, manipulation as the medium of divine human interaction, the body as an instrument of religious transaction rather than a temple of covenant dignity. Those templates, unless radically transformed by an entirely different encounter with the living God, would have governed her parenting of the next covenant generation in ways that would have gradually and perhaps imperceptibly diluted the distinctive covenant formation that Abraham's lineage required. The research on what Mary Main called earned security, the finding that adults who did not receive secure attachment in childhood can develop a secure internal working model through subsequent therapeutic and relational experiences, is also relevant here. It tells us that the Canaanite prohibition is not a permanent verdict of exclusion on any individual. It is a wisdom about the statistical probability of what a specific cultural formation will produce in the intimate context of covenant household life, offered not as contempt but as protection. For the contemporary listener navigating questions of intimate relationship, friendship, and community formation, the Canaanite prohibition is an invitation to ask these questions with the depth they deserve. What internal working models are being formed in the people I am considering for my most intimate covenant relationships? What relational templates have been installed in them by their formation? Not to judge the worth of any individual person, but to discern, with the maturity of someone who loves the covenant, whether the relational habits and spiritual assumptions of a potential partner will strengthen or subtly weaken the formation of the next generation. And most importantly, what internal working models are operating in me? What Canaanite templates have I inherited from the world that formed me? Templates of performance-based acceptance, of appeasement as the strategy for managing divine displeasure, of the self as an instrument rather than a beloved? Because the work of covenant formation begins inside, not outside. The protective boundary that matters most is not the boundary we draw around our intimate relationships, but the boundary we draw around the beliefs and the relational templates that govern our own inner world. Abraham's prohibition is ultimately a call to audit the Canaanite influences that dwell within us. To identify the daughters of Canaan that have taken up residence in the household of our own soul. And to say, with the same decisive key aim of verse 4, not that, but this. Not the relational template of fear and appeasement, but the covenant template of grace and trust. Not the internal working model of the Canaanite world, but the internal working model of the child of the God who blesses Bakol, in all things, with the kneeling intensity of Peel love. This is the deepest application of the Canaanite prohibition. And it is an application that requires no judgment of any external person or culture. It is entirely the work of interior transformation, the work that the Spirit of God has been commissioned to do in you from the moment you first heard the testimony of the divine servant. Not this, but this. Not Canaan, but the country and the kindred of your truest covenant identity. Join us in episode 9 where we explore Ki Haim as the grammar of divine redirection, the ancient social infrastructure of the Mulada, the church's birth community, the loneliness epidemic, Cyril of Alexandria's great typology, and the Marian resonance of Rebecca's willing yes. Contact us at Christ4Life143@gmail.com. Subscribe and stay with us.